Well, welcome. My name is Adam Wiggins, and I'm glad you're joining for this session. This presentation was first made at Mission Correctional Institution under the Wellness Program that's led by Dr. Grace Leon Bodenbach and Pastor Dan Friesen, an institutional chaplain. It's been a highly effective program. And one of the things we wanted to do is we wanted to look at the brain and trauma. The impact of trauma on the brain, on our entire nervous system. And it has application to all of us. It has application for those of us who provide reintegration support in providing effective support and leading to an effective reintegration pathway for the men and the women that we serve. But it also has personal application. Trauma is a very subjective kind of thing, obviously, but trauma plays out to greater and lesser extents in all of our lives. And so as I was thinking about this session originally, one of the thoughts that was running through my mind was this thought of it's not rocket science. You probably heard the phrase before. And someone might say, make this statement kind of sarcastically, right? You may ask a question and their response may be, it's not rocket science. Well, in this case, just to put things into context, this is rocket science. This is brain science. This is neurology that we're talking about. And so in some ways, we recognize that this is highly complex. But this section isn't all about, just doing a deep dive into our brain anatomy, physiology, neurology, if you will. I'd like us to engage with this subject, this whole idea of the brain and trauma, through the lens of three important questions that lead to the key question. Now, the first question, first series of three questions that I want you to think about with me are these. Why do we think what we think? Why do we have the thoughts that we have? Where do those thoughts come from? What are those thoughts? What are they all about? Why does our thinking seem to go in a certain direction? And in fact, in times we may say it's stuck in a loop, like it just goes over and over and over again. And it seems difficult to get past that. Why do we feel what we feel? Why do we have the emotions that we have? And why do these emotions sometimes seem to have such an influential role in our lives? So why do we feel what we feel? Why do we do what we do? And, we might say, okay, there's a development here, our thoughts, our feelings, our emotions, and our behavior. Why do we think? Why do we feel? Why do we do what we do? And it all comes back to this key question. And the key question is, who is the boss of me? Who is the boss of me? Are my thoughts? Are my emotions, my feelings the boss of me? I just do whatever they tell me to do. Is my behavior, in a sense, is that the boss of me? Is that like the core part of who I am? Just how I act out? Very important questions for all of us. Now, as we start to think about the brain and how the brain functions in our body and the relationship of the brain and trauma, on one hand, we step back and we go, wow, this is incredibly complex. Again, this is brain science. As I was preparing for today, I just came across information that said within the skull, the brain as we understand it, so many of us, this is the brain, within our skull, there is something like 100 billion neurons. We're going to talk about neurons in a minute, but that there is something like 100 billion. Neurons are this interconnection of this superhighway, now importantly, that both send and receive messages. This is very important when it comes to understanding trauma, that both send and receives messages, these impulses that go throughout our body, chemically charged impulses that run throughout our whole body, from our brain through our nervous system, throughout our whole body. So on one hand, there is this incredible complexity. It's not hard, just when you think about neurology, the brain, the nervous system alone, to feel some connection with the ancient scripture, where a man was reflecting. It's in the Psalms, and he says, we are fearfully and wonderfully made. That is probably no more true than when it comes to the intricate wiring of our brain and our nervous system. So we have all of this interconnection that is going through us. Literally a trillion connections of the superhighway of neurons in our brain alone, which is just absolutely staggering when you think about it. This picture of our brain and the various components of our brain that we'll talk about in a moment, let me just stop for a second and to say a neuron that I've referenced is a special cell of the nervous system. We'll talk about the nervous system that sends and receives messages. Neurons help us think, move, feel, and react. Now, why is that important? It's important because, step back, pause for a moment to go, there is this trillion interconnected superhighway running through us. And the significance of that is that there is almost, for all intents and purposes, unlimited choice. So just to stop for a minute and think about trauma, just to stop for a second and to think about those times where we get caught in certain types of thinking. It's just like, this is who I am, certain types of emotions and feelings that just keep coming up and just seem to control us, moving to the behaviors that we just seem to exhibit over and over again in our lives, and to go, well, hold on a second. If this superhighway of neurons is running through brain, nervous system, into the body, what is that saying? On one level, it's saying this: there is unlimited choice. There is unlimited choice. There is the ability, it's called neuroplasticity, there is the ability to take new paths, to have new thoughts, to have new decision-making abilities, to have new expressions of feelings and emotions, and therefore behaviors in our lives. And just a quick picture, one of the ways I like to think about this is if we have a familiar, a special destination in our lives that, we just love to go to this place, and we used to take this trail to this place, a trail was established, we just know, this is the way I have to get there. Maybe sometimes, we thought to ourselves, this is kind of rough going, right? There's a lot of hills, there's a lot of rocks, there's a lot of roots. It's like, this isn't the easiest trail to go on. Well, what this super connection of neurons tells us is that we have the ability to establish a new trail. That we don't just have to take the trail that we're used to, the trail that's established. We can take a new trail, and that new trail can lead us to better outcomes. Maybe we get to the destination sooner. Maybe we get to the destination in a way that we just enjoy the journey more. And so this is the importance of recognizing that we are wired in such a complex way that shouldn't just overwhelm us, but make us realize that there is just this unlimited choice that is going to impact our thinking, our emotions, our feelings, leading to our behavior. Now, what I'd like us to do as we think about and through our thinking, our understanding, is look at the brain, again, through various lenses. There's different ways that we can think about the brain, and hopefully these different pictures of the brain, if you will give us a better perspective that will help us to understand why I think what I think, why I feel what I feel, why I do what I do. And one of the ways that we can think about the brain, and this may be familiar with you, is from this perspective. So this perspective is really a horizontal perspective. It's as if we're looking down on our brain, and we're realizing that our brain is actually in two hemispheres. and you've probably heard this before, there's right brain, there's left brain. We give certain characteristics to the left brain, certain characteristics to the right brain. More often than not, the left brain is described as being analytical, logical, detail-oriented, our language centers. Now that's very important when it comes to trauma. And then our right brain, that often is described as being more creative, more artistic, intuitive, imaginative. Now it seems like there's some bias in the person who created this slide originally. It wasn't me. And here we have the right side of the brain, and it's all lit up. It's all beautifully colored. And then the left side of the brain, the analytical side of our brain, is this gray mass. And we sometimes talk about the brain as gray mass. Nevertheless, both of these sides of our brain are invaluably important for our function. They are not two separate sides of our brain. We can be more predominant. One person is more predominant, right brain, left brain, in terms of their engagement with life and questions and the way that we interact with life. But between these two hemispheres is this connecting point. The connecting point is called the corpus callosum. It's such a great name, isn't it? A corpus callosum. But it's this connecting point where there's this transfer of information. And of course, we're bilateral, the right side of the brain being reflected in the left side of the body, the left side of the brain being reflected in the right side of the body. But that there is this interconnection that's running between the right brain and the left brain. And if you want to do a deep dive in this, it's very interesting to see if somebody has had an injury that somehow that connection has been severed. Sometimes in terms of epilepsy and severe cases, there actually is the severing of the corpus callosum surgically that represents or that concludes, that reflects in a lot of very interesting types of behaviors. And so here's this idea of our brain, our understanding of the brain, the left brain, the right brain. Now what's very interesting, invaluable insight in many respects, is that trauma, when we experience a significant traumatic experience, that the memory, typically fragmented memory, not cohesive or adaptive memory as it's called, that traumatic memory is stored in the right side of the brain. Now, what's significant about that? We don't have, for one, the language skills that there are from the left side of the brain. So in some way, it's like the trauma, the severity of the situation, our left brain, if you will, the analytical side of our brain, it's unable to take it in. And because it's unable to take it in a sense, it's also unable to put it out. It's unable to communicate. So you or I may have a traumatic experience, and we may not have the words to be able to describe this experience. The experience in our memory may be buried and fragmented in such a way that we cannot retrieve it the way that we retrieve other memories that maybe occurred in more normal life, right? Those kinds of situations where it was like low stress or even medium stress, where we could go, okay, I can kind of place this. Not so with trauma. And so there's the need, we find, for very specific therapies for trauma to address the trauma in a person's life. So often, more often than not, talk therapies, what are called talk therapies, just talk about your experience. Well, you don't have the words to talk about the experience because those traumatic experiences are taken in on the right side and stored on the right side of the brain. And we don't have words. We don't have a time stamp, if you will, to talk about it. We'll talk about that more in a bit. So there's one perspective of the brain, right? It's like, okay, here's horizontally, right brain, left brain. And then we move on and we look at what's often referred to as the brain lobes. So we've moved to a more vertical picture of the brain. And we can start starting at the bottom, if you will, the more primitive brain, the part of the brain that develops first. That's why we'll start here. When we're in the womb, when we are as a fetus, and the brain stem is really concerned about keeping us alive, about managing those parts of our body that keep us alive through our nervous system and the impulses. So our breathing and our heart rate and all of those good things. That's down in our brain stem. Sometimes it's called the primitive brain, sometimes it's called the lizard brain. And when we're reactive, we often are living out of that brain stem and its urges and its impulses. We're going to talk about that more. We move up, and of course, this is the left side of the brain. The left side and the right side of the brain may look a little differently, but in terms of the major lobes, this is significant. So we have the brain stem, we move up and we go into the temporal lobe. And the temporal lobe is more about our hearing and our attention. And you can read these kinds of descriptions. If we have injury in this area, it would affect our hearing, right? Because that is the part of the brain that is allocated to this area. Also, in this part of the brain, sometimes this midbrain is referred to as the limbic area. And we're going to talk about some very important details in the limbic area. Then we move around to the front, and this is our cortex area, the prefrontal cortex. And so we move from the primitive brain to the mammalian brain, the middle brain, to the prefrontal cortex. And, you know, most neuroscientists and biologists say this is what makes us distinct as human beings. This is our ability to have rational thoughts, our rational, our analytical, our problem solving, our concentration, all of these good things that are indications, reflections of being a human being. And there is a very important interrelationship between our prefrontal cortex and our limbic system. Two areas in particular, we're going to look at them: the amygdala, the hippocampus, and our brain stem, relating to what's often identified as the vagus nerve, or what is the vagus nerve as it relates to our whole nervous system, and what happens when when trauma enters into our lives. And so we keep moving around. There's the parietal area. This is the area, I don't know about the piranha, but if that helps you, there you go. It's the sensitive area. It's sensations, it's perceptions, it's body awareness, it's attention, it's calculations, all in this parietal area. You can see the main function in the sensory area, processing sensory information. We have the occipital area. The occipital area is concerned with our sight, our visual systems, visual information, and it processes visuals, perceptions of shapes and sizes. And then we keep, moving along and moving down, more getting towards the brainstem area again, and we have this cerebellum area. And this is our coordination rhythm, our proprioception, in other words, proprioception, our balance, our sense of self as we move through the world. And so just to put this into perspective, why do I think what I think? Why do I feel what I feel? Why do I do what I do? Now, each one of these lobes of the brain are interrelated and interconnected, but they are all influenced and impacted, and even in terms of the way they interrelate, by the experience of major trauma events in our lives. So then, just a quick overview. There's our brain from the from the vertical side, these different lobes of the brain. And then we move into just another understanding of the brain. And I thought this was important for us to understand in terms of, why do I think what I think? Why do I feel what I feel? Why do I do what I do? Because there's also this perspective of the brain. And this perspective sees our brain as far greater than sort of just this area above our shoulders between our ears. The brain is often thought about in these three areas. There's our head brain, which we have been talking about, the various lobes and so forth, and what each of these lobes represents, is responsible for. Then there is what's often referred to as the heart brain. Now you can read the descriptions of the heart brain, but isn't that very interesting? And if you're like me, that sometimes maybe you've thought in the past, well, that's not really connected. Maybe what I feel isn't important, right? Doesn't matter. And yet we see with this superhighway of neurons running through us that our heart is actually informing our head. That's a legitimate thing. That, our intuition is something that's real. I'm not saying our intuition is always right, but our intuition is real, and we should pay attention to it and what it is informing us about. It's not just our heart separately as, this organ in our body that's pumping our blood, but that there actually is this intuitive sense that's coming from our heart, and that the superhighway between our brain and our heart is active and alive. Now, again, aligns, that's an important, aligns mind, heart, body, and emotions. Sends more messages to the brain. In other words, sends more messages to the brain than it receives from the brain. So it is informing. Again, important to pay attention to. And thirdly, the gut brain, which is like the gut brain. What is that? Actually, the enteric system, this part of our nervous system, is very significant. And you think about it with stress, right? Never mind trauma. And what happens when we're under a lot of stress? When there's a lot of what's called cortisol that's just going through our body, the adrenaline and the cortisol, and where do we feel it? More often than not, we feel it down in our gut. Now, this gut brain is actually often referred to as our second brain. That's, if you will, that's how loud of a voice that it has. So just to complete the picture of what is our brain, how is our brain active in terms of what I think, what I feel, and therefore what I do, who is the boss of me, all of these different components of what we understand our brain to be are informing these areas. So now let's move to this very important interrelationship there is between these various components of, well, let's just call it our head brain, but now head brain informed by gut brain and heart brain. So we move to this perspective. So this is like, okay, we're gonna have a window into your head brain. And what do we have here? We've got the brain stems that we talked about, the primitive brain, the sometimes called the lizard brain, the part of our brain that's very much preoccupied with keeping us alive. And it's very important when it comes to how we function in our nervous system, with our brain connected with our nervous system through the body, which we're going to look at in a moment. So here's our brain stem. We're moving up to more of this mid area. The mid area, it's often referred to as the limbic system. A few really key components in the limbic system, especially when it comes to trauma, but frankly, with everyday life, with keeping us alive, with moving through life in a regulated, kind of balanced way. And can we have any management in that? Why do I think what I think? Why do I feel what I feel? Why do I do what I do? Limbic system, big player in answering those questions. And you think of two areas in particular, and that's our hippocampus and our amygdala. Hippocampus and our amygdala. Now, hippocampus is sometimes referred to as the librarian. It stores the information. It's got all of the reference books on the shelf so that we can go back and like every little situation we come across isn't a brand new situation, but can be informed by our previous experiences that can help us be more balanced in terms of our state of mind and our nervous system. So here's the hippocampus. I like to think about this. If this helps you at all, the hippocampus is like hippopotamus. A hippopotamus is like an elephant in Africa, right? An elephant has what? Elephants have these great long memories. And so we remember, oh yeah, the hippocampus, that's where my elephant lives. No, that's where my memory, short-term memory, long-term memory, that's where it resides. Now there's some very interesting details about this because the hippocampus is very connected with both the amygdala. I mean, everything's interconnected, but for point of conversation, the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex. Now, the amygdala is sometimes referred to, if you want to sort of just have a picture of what the amygdala does, it's referred to as the watchdog, as the smoke alarm. So in other words, the amygdala is that very important component of our brain and nervous system that's always scanning for threat. Is everything okay? Good. Relax. Relax. We're going to talk about the nervous system in a moment and why this is important. But the amygdala is like this watchdog. And when we're in a low stress state, when we're in even a medium stress state, the amygdala is connected to the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is, this management system. It's called the thalamus, this management system. It's able to make that connection with whatever threat or whatever situation we're in, so that the prefrontal cortex can release. It actually releases a hormone. It's not just like, oh, here's wisdom, to address the area, inform the area, but it actually releases a hormone, a GABA hormone, and that's like calm. If you heard the expression, I think it's a Seinfeld expression, serenity now, right? Well, this is, in many respects, this is the prefrontal cortex releasing its gabagoo. You can call it like gabba yabba doo, like Fred Flintstone would just change it a little bit, and it's like, start to get a little tense there, but okay, we've been through something like this before. It's all okay. Now, it's very interesting that what happens in our normal state, so I'd say normal state being life, low stress, medium stress, and a high stress or a trauma kind of situation. Now, there is another picture of the brain that is just another example of what we're talking about. That's the hand model of the brain. So, I mean, if you like, you just hold your hand up and you go, okay, here's the brain stem. Let me get this centered. Here's the brain stem. Here is the limbic area, so your amygdala, your hippocampus, your hypothalamus, your thalamus, and here's the prefrontal cortex. You see that? So the prefrontal cortex, or your cortex really, and prefrontal cortex here, it comes around and it surrounds the limbic system, which is it's inside. Now, what happens if this visual works for you? What happens when your vagus nerve, and we'll look at this in a moment, in your nervous system picks up threat and goes danger, danger, danger? The message sent up into this limbic area, and when it's high stress, when it's trauma, what happens? Now, we hear this expression sometimes, I lost my head. You see that? What happened there? I flipped my lid, right? All of a sudden, I am just flooded with all these feelings, with all of this emotion, and there literally is this disconnect between your cortex, your prefrontal cortex, and your limbic area. So the prefrontal cortex, sometimes referred to, I'll give you another, maybe a silly name, but referred to sometimes as your owl brain, is no longer interconnected with your limbic system, your warning system, and cannot inform it, cannot release what we call that GABA-goo, that hormone, to be able to calm things down. Now, we're going to deep dive into that a little more, but that just provides a little bit of a visual about our brain. And so as we continue to think about this and the interrelationship of our brain and our experiences of trauma and life in general, we do have to notice the interrelationship with our entire nervous system. It's just vitally connected to, in many respects, why I think what I think, why I do what I do, why I feel what I feel. And so if you just take a quick look at this, I just want to give you an overview. This is kind of complex, but here's our nervous system. And so you can see up top, you've got your CNS, central nervous system, PNS, peripheral nervous system. The CNS is literally our nervous system, our neurons that are running down through the center of us, down from our brain through our spinal area, our spinal column. But then there is this interconnection that happens with the PNS. Notice that? The PNS being our peripheral nervous system. And you think about that, central, peripheral, right? I mean, it's pretty straightforward in a way, in spite of all the detail on this page. And this is outside the neurons, the nerves that are outside of our central nervous system. what I want you to do a bit of a deep dive on with me is to notice that under the PNS, the peripheral nervous system, are these two components, three, to be very literal. We're not going to talk about our enteric. It is our gut, and of course our gut is so impacted by stress and trauma. But what I want us to focus on is what is called our sympathetic and our parasympathetic nervous system. Our sympathetic and our parasympathetic. Now, we can think about these two areas in a little more detail like this. Here's our autonomic, as it's called, nervous system. Automatic in many senses. These things just happen, are taken care of, are impulses inside of us. In other words, we're not so often, thinking about, am I breathing? Am I breathing? Is my heart beating? Is my heart beating? I mean, sometimes, things may go out of whack and may alert us, but moment by moment, it's not like we're having to go, okay, beat heart, beat heart, beat heart, beat heart, breathe, breathe, breathe. It's like, no, it's automatic, autonomic nervous system. And our autonomic nervous system is made in many respects to create balance, or what's called homeostasis, this balance inside of us between what's often referred to as our rest and digest, our break, if you will, sometimes referred to in the parasympathetic, and our gas, the gas being our sympathetic. So if you just look at the parasympathetic with me for a moment, rest and digest, all of those things that are happening inside of us being managed by our nervous system that help us to rest and digest. We need to rest and digest to be healthy people. And our nervous system, controlled through our vagus nerve, in many respects, our limbic system up into, down through the brainstem, the limbic system, prefrontal cortex, it's doing all these things to keep us alive, to regulate and to manage our bodies. So the rest and the digest. And then there is what's often referred to as the gas, or our sympathetic nervous system. It says fight or flight. We'll come back to that in a moment, but you might just want to think about the gas, the energy. What's our sympathetic system doing? It's getting us ready to go. It's getting us ready to move. So in some ways, the gas and the brake isn't entirely accurate, because what's happening with the sympathetic, it's giving to those areas that are going to help us to have the capacity to move, right? We're going to have these dilated pupils so that we can see more clearly. We're going to have more oxygen going to our lungs, breath, so we can move more readily. We're going to have, the blood pumping more in our heart for whatever that situation may be. But those other areas, the areas like our digestion and such, it's like, well, that's not so important now. We need energy right now. So we're not going to focus on those areas. But then we move to the parasympathetic, the rest and digest, and we go, okay, there's going to be areas that the parasympathetic focuses on, gives greater attention and energy towards, because in this state, we want these things to happen. But other things, in other words, the movement kind of things, our breathing will slow down. Our pulse will slow down. One of the ways that you can just practically do this, sort of go, what's parasympathetic, what's sympathetic, is if you breathe in. Take a breath. Take a couple of breaths. Not just a deep breath, but you can take shorter breaths too. What is that? That's your sympathetic. It's getting you ready to go. It's filling you up with oxygen, right? You're ready to move. Take a nice calming breath out. And you and I literally feel ourselves calm down. We go, oh, wow. We can calm ourselves. That's our parasympathetic at work. Now, sometimes our sympathetic and parasympathetic and our autonomic nervous system can be looked at in very negative ways. But I just want you to think about this with me, because this is very important when it comes to our understanding of trauma and understanding what's happening with our bodies and the thoughts that we have and the urges that we feel and the behaviors that we live out. So we look at, okay, autonomic nervous system, our ANS, our sympathetic nervous system, our parasympathetic nervous system. Now notice, each of these, sympathetic and parasympathetic, has this safety response, or maybe we could even say normal response, and it has a threat response. So on the sympathetic side of things, we go, what's a safety response of my sympathetic nervous system? Mobilization, so, go, mobilization into what? Play and excitement. You think play and excitement, what's that talking about? Well, as adults, we would go, that's activity, that's sports, that's training, right? I'm gonna bench press, a heavy amount, and what do? Sometimes we'll be like we'll take a few quick breaths. I was out for a run the other day, and I was, getting about 3/4 of the way through my run. I'm going, oh man, this is supposed to be a tempo run, like a fairly fast-paced run. I'm starting to lose it. And what did I do? I started taking some shorter, quicker breaths, slower out breath. I started taking these quicker, and it kind of energized me again to maintain my pace, in the run. Now, what's the threat response? The threat response is, and this is becoming, pretty well known these days culturally, right? The threat response is the fight or flight. So we have danger, right? That amygdala has picked up on, there is a threat. And this threat is happening within high stress. And so it's like, we need to go. We need the gas now. And what our nervous system does is it prepares us for whether it's fight, we're going to take on whatever this threat is, or it's flight, we are going to get out of here. We have the capacity to do that, unlike the parasympathetic we'll look at in a moment. We just need to, we need to get out of here. In other words, the saber-toothed tiger, no, I'm not taking that thing on. I am getting out of here. Now, our brain isn't processing. It can run twice as fast as we can, but nevertheless, that's another issue altogether. So let's just jump over to the parasympathetic. Remember we said one of the ways it's talked about is sometimes the brake, right? So here we have this brake mechanism in our nervous system. And we go, what's the safety response of that brake? The safety response is to go rest and digest. Our bodies, our nervous system, of course, wants to keep us alive. Our brainstem, it's working to keep us alive, those things to do. What needs to happen when there is no threat around? Our parasympathetic kicks in, and so the rest and digest is taking place. And very important to have that for our health. Now, when we have trauma and our systems are flooded with all of these cortisol hormones and chemicals, as they're called, what happens is we're not entering into that rest and digest. And that shows up in a lot of different ways in our body. These become very pronounced with this threat state under our parasympathetic. And here we'll have the freeze. This threat is so big, there's nothing I can do. Or fawning, right, is another thing that's often called, that we freeze, or we fawn, or we faint, because in a sense our system has just gone, there's no option here. I just give up. I can't fight it. I can't flee of it. I just give up to it. And this is also a very well-known reaction when it comes to major trauma in one's life. And so here we have these different responses, and how our nervous system is reacting in these different states. What our nervous system is really trying to do is to create this balance between the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. You put trauma into the middle of that, and then there becomes these evidences in our body because our system is not experiencing balance. It's always, in a sense, in this trauma state or this maybe just a stress state. And we have these really excellent books. If you want to do a deeper dive on this, Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, The Body Keeps Score. You've maybe heard of that, and how high stress and trauma, it reflects in our bodies. You know, we might even just say high stress, what happens? My gut, right? I'm feeling it in my gut, and all these different conditions that we experience in our gut. Dr. Gabor Mate, who was chief physician with the Portland Society, downtown Eastside, for a number of years. And he just wrote a book, I believe it's called When the Body Says No, like enough, I have no more to give. Now, I'd like you to continue thinking about this with me from this perspective, because it's a good thing, right, to have a smoke alarm or a watchdog. What do I mean by that? Well, if we said the amygdala, like here's our vigilant, looking for threat system, our amygdala connected to our nervous system, the hippocampus, the librarian, remember, and our prefrontal cortex, sometimes called our owl brain. If, our watchdog is barking, our smoke alarm is blaring, that can be a good thing. I remember our family, we put some hardwood floors into our house, and we installed the hardwood, and then we did the refinishing or the finishing. And, it says very clearly, on these refinishing compounds, because you pour them together and then use it. And it says very clearly, okay, don't just leave the rag that you use to put this on. It says you need to immerse it in water. Well, why would we read the instructions, right? So the next morning, we're woken up with this blaring smoke detector. And what was it telling us? We went downstairs, and that main area of the house, it was filled with smoke. And just as we came down the stairs, it erupted. The rag erupted into flame. It just like that. It's like, man, we could have burned our house down. Thank you, smoke detector, right? It's like our smoke detector. We're glad for a smoke detector. We're glad for a watchdog. If you've ever had a watchdog, the watchdog can actually give you like a heads up, like, hey, there is a threat in the yard, and it gives us a chance to prepare. But here's the question. What happens when your smoke detector is always blaring? What happens when your watchdog is always barking? I don't, maybe, we say, oh, we just get used to it. I don't know. I don't know if I ever get used to a dog barking. It just creates stress in me. I don't know about for you. What if there's a smoke alarm that just continues blaring? Like, have you ever had that where you've had a too sensitive smoke alarm, and you've got to get the broom handle or whatever, if you've got high ceilings, try and get up there and hit the button to turn the things off, and you just can't hit it, but you're standing there, and the blaring of the alarm is just like, oh man, that's just creating more stress in my body listening to that. Those are two very graphic pictures of what happens to our nervous system when our amygdala, when our watchdog is always on alert. So if we are in high stress, if we have had trauma, especially unintegrated trauma, then our alarm system, if you will not just be vigilant, it will be hyper vigilant. And one of the things that we can reference when it comes to memory is that the way our hippocampus stores memory is quite different under low and medium stress than high stress. Low, medium stress, we'd say our hippocampus, that memory that it has captured for us, this librarian, remember, is like, here's this file, somebody wrote us a letter about this experience we had together with them. There's a date on the letter. We can read about the experience. We maybe didn't see it exactly as they did, but nevertheless, we're taken back, right? We have a memory of the experience. We think, oh, okay, I remember that. We were we were at the beach and I can still smell the salt water. I can still, we have like this visual memory. I can still see how beautiful the water was with the sun reflecting off the waves. We can go on the heat of the sand, like our senses, the heat of the sand under our feet, the smell of, the hot dogs that were coming from the concession, whatever it may be. Not with trauma memories, not with high stress memories. That librarian still might have the file, but you open that file up or you try to access that file, and what's there? You ever have a letter that you've kept, but you had some kind of flood or something like that, and you open up the letter and the date is gone. It's completely washed out. The paragraphs, you can't make any of them out. There's a word here and here and here. You really don't know. It's just like, what was this? What was this about? There's just these words. And what so often happens in trauma and high stress is that's what's stored in our memory bank, if you will. And what comes out, it's not, as it's called, it's not adaptive. In many ways, it's maladaptive, we'd say. It's fragmented. And that's why, use an overly popular word, that's why when we have PTSD, you've heard of that, post-traumatic stress disorder, when we have major trauma in our lives, we can be triggered by something in the present that all of a sudden causes all of this intense emotion and feeling that reflects in our behavior to come exploding out of us. And we think, what is that? Where did that come from? Because we do not have that adaptive memory that gives us enough clarity, and because it was trauma and was stored in such a way through, remember, right side of our brain, we don't have the language to even talk about it. Which, to inject some hope into this is why some of the current trauma therapies are very significant in helping us to process, desensitize, and process that trauma so they don't come exploding out of us, so that we can answer the question, why do I think what I think? Why do I feel what I feel? Why do I do what I do? With some very intelligent, owl-informed intelligence. So this whole area of being overwhelmed by our trauma, of having, being hypervigilant, having the trauma being the ruling emotion or the ruling influence in our life, it's actually called something. And you can look at this slide with me. It's got a lot of detail on it, but it's called an amygdala hijack. And what happens when we have, let's say we have low stress, medium stress, normal life, right? That what happens is that our amygdala, that is triggered, a part of our nervous system, the vagus nerve, working together to help us really to stay safe and to stay alive. In low stress, medium stress, our amygdala is able to what? The thalamus is connecting the amygdala to the hippocampus and the prefrontal cortex, the owl brain, and we're able to inform the situation, let's just say maybe with some clear thinking. Remember the visual of the hand, the brain hand, the hand brain? We haven't flipped our lid. Everything is still connected. But when we put high stress into the equation, when we have trauma, maybe you've experienced this yourself, maybe you know people that have this, we'd call it hypervigilance. It's not just vigilance, like, got to be on my guard. There's stress out there, watchdogs on duty. It's like barking all the time, smoke alarm going all the time. We flip our lid, we blow our top, very graphically. And so there is no longer this connection. And suddenly we find ourselves triggered, overwhelmed with feelings and emotions that become controlling to us. So we might say, oh man, what hope is there? Here I am. What do I do about this? Well, you can't talk yourself You can't talk yourself out of, or you can't talk yourself into, maybe more correctly put, into calming your amygdala. And I would say this is a very important slide. If there's one slide, maybe you want to study this slide or ingest this slide, practice this slide, calming the amygdala. Now, the goal, we can't reason with the amygdala. We have to calm it first. Remember what we said about the owl brain is it's not only being informed by the owl brain wisdom in the situation, it is the release of this hormone into the limbic system, amygdala, hippocampus area, hypothalamus, thalamus, the limbic areas. It is the release of this GABA hormone that literally is like gabagoo that can calm things down. Now, how do you do that? Well, there's actually very intentional, very important ways that you and I do this. Remember our sympathetic and parasympathetic, and practicing our breathing. You may hear this a lot. Now, I know it's frustrating. I mean, it may stress you out or it may make you angry to have somebody say to you, take a breath, right? You ever have someone say this? Take a breath. It's like, be quiet. Like, tell me to take a breath. You take a breath. But when we tell ourselves to take a breath, when we go, I'm feeling this panic. I'm feeling this anxiety. I'm feeling this stress. Okay, I'm going to be intentional about my breathing. It's just physiological, right? It's like, breathe in. There's lots of really great exercises that can help us with our breathing. Lots of different types of breathing that we can do to help us, you've probably heard this term, regulate ourselves, calm ourselves down. Breathing is a big one. As simple as it sounds, you and I typically don't pay a lot of attention to our breathing. When we pay attention to our breathing, when we're intentional about our breathing, it can do a lot of very significant things for us. One of them being to calm us down. Deep, slow breaths. There's something else called grounding. Grounding are those activities that we can engage in through our senses. So in other words, notice what you can see, what you can hear, what you can feel, what you can smell, what you can taste. One of the shows we're enjoying watching right now is called High Potential. And, as we say today, she's a little bit on the spectrum. She's sort of a, detective consultant. She's a little on the spectrum. And, what you see her doing, if she gets high stress, if she panics, if she has anxiety, she'll stop and she'll say, here are 5 things that I can see. I can see that book. I can see that light. I can see that computer monitor. I can see that pen. She names those things very specifically. There are 3 things that I can smell. There are, 4 things that I can feel right here. And what that happens is it helps us to calm the amygdala. It creates that slowing down, that mindfulness. That in many ways we can say mindfulness is really just slowing down so we're not just being reactive. There's called soothing movement. You can call it whatever kind of movement you want, but it's the movement of rocking or stretching or walking. Some of those are bilateral movements. Bilateral movement, very important in trauma therapy often. And these things can, again, help reset, help calm your system. There is connection. And you maybe have found this. There's regulation. Regulation is in a sense, us regulating our system, calming our system. But there's also something called co-regulation. So it's not just me, it's we. And so there may be those people in your life, especially if you feel panicked or stressed or anxious, and in simply being with them, their state of mind helps you to regulate yourself. There is co-regulation, right? So the opposite is you're being around someone and they're just making you more stressed. It's like, okay, take a break. But there can be those that can help you to regulate yourself, to calm your system down, because their calmness, their regulation is able to transfer and impact you. There is rhythmic or repetitive action, drumming fingers, doodling, tapping, like artists, musicians, simply writing in a journal. These kinds of things can help you. You take up your instrument and you play. You're feeling stressed out, you play. Why do you so often feel so much more peace after? The very act of the music you're engaging in, the drawing, that you're doing, whatever it is, helps to calm your system. And then there's comfort items or sensory tools. There can be something soft, a fidget, like a squeeze ball or whatever. There can be a blanket. Often people use weighted blankets. They can feel that on their body, and the senses are engaged. We're not disconnected from our bodies in terms of our nervous system, that weight on us. So in many respects, Linus's security blanket, it is a real thing. And so I want us to recognize that there are very specific things that we can personally do. If we go, I have these experiences where what I think and what I feel and what I do don't seem to be under my control. They're coming from a place in me that I don't understand. Then I would like to encourage you to see a trauma therapist like Dr. Grace Leon Bodenbach, who is on our board of directors, a trauma therapist, perhaps one that practices what's called EMDR or other modes, somatic therapies that help again to bring that balance to your body, that desensitizes the trauma and helps you to process the trauma so that you're not caught up in this loop. But at the same time, to recognize, whatever your spiritual practice may be, that God has given us and created us with a body that has the capacity to move towards healing as we understand it. I think of one of the great scriptures that's meaningful to me. Think on these things. So literally, to go, here's all the different things, all the different paths, all the different ways that my mind can move. But I'm going to think on these things, on the pure things, on the good things, on the safe things. What are my resources in this time of stress? And allow what God has given us through our owl brains, which make us distinctly human, to be able to slow down and calm our state of mind and our nervous system. Well, this has been a lot. Remember, it's not rocket science. Oh, yeah, it is. It's brain science, just as complex. And so I'd like to encourage you that if you have more questions about this, if you want to apply this, then please reach out to us. You can connect with me, adam.betterlife@gmail.com. And I'd love to address your questions, perhaps to connect you with Dr. Grace or myself when it comes to trauma-informed therapy. But I hope that this has been helpful for you, and I wish you all the very best.